You ever heard of an Eastern promise? It said, like, bring forth the Eastern promise of renewal. You ever heard of an Eastern promise? It said, like, bring forth the Eastern promise of renewal.
You definitely think that everything that the nuisance tells you is very honest and the truth the best at that he knows it. You definitely think that everything that the nuisance tells you is very honest and the truth the best at that he knows it.
This is how I clean up and enhance my audio tracks when I edit for LCP DnD, plus some extra things as well. Normally I do all my audio cleanup in Adobe Audition. I like it much better. It's got this nice grid layout so you can see how everything lines up to your numbers on the right. It's got multi-track if you need it, so you can just slide your tracks around, move them and edit them in here, and then open them up individually if you want to. It's just really great. But you got to pay for it, so we're going back to good old Audacity, because a lot of people use it. You can do pretty much all the same stuff. First step is to have audio. Here's the sample I recorded. Creed lyrics. Court is in session, and a verdict is in. Here's me speaking them at my normal speaking volume. I should have been dead on a Sunday morning, banging my head. And here's me speaking in the voice of the character I play on Fillmore's Crossing, the low voice of Tom. This is the voice of Tom, very low and close to the mic. And I have this sample that gradually gets really loud and then it gradually gets really soft for something I want to show you, but we'll get to that. I'm going to expand this so it's easier to see. I'm also going to change this to waveform decibels so it just looks different. It's easier to understand the numbers on the side. You probably already know, but 0 is the threshold, the line at which anything above it gets distorted. So we want to keep all of our waves below it. What the hard limiter is going to do is chop all the peaks off of these waves so it's flat across the board. It also gives us the option to boost all the valleys, the low points, so that they're louder. When you're using the waveform decibel view, you can see exactly what number you're going to chop the threshold at. -10, -15, -20. You can zoom in and get more specific. Get 19s, get 21s, get 23. As far as I know with Audacity, -10 is the lowest that you can chop these things. So we'll go to Effect, we'll go down to Limiter, and we'll type in -10. And as you can see, it chopped them all at -10. I can limit a lot lower than 10 when I'm using Adobe Audition, but I'm not sure how to do it with Audacity, so if you know, please leave me a hate message in the comments. I could use other methods to trim it lower, but I think what I'm actually going to do is try to bring up the valleys instead. These low points are going to become louder. So I'll undo what I did with that limiter, go back to Effect, go back down to Limiter, and I'm going to do it with Input Gains. I'll boost them by 4. So it's going to go 4 decibels, bump, 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 from the valleys up. So all the low points below the threshold are going to get boosted by 4 decibels. I'm still going to chop it at 10, and we'll see what happens. I should have been dead on a Sunday morning, banging my head. I should have been dead on a Sunday morning, banging my head. This is the voice of Tom. This is the voice of Tom. The reason I chop off all the tips of these peaks is because I want to bring the loudest point of this entire recording up to -1. I know people that only like to boost to -3, but I'm crazy! Before I trimmed them all, I had some really high points and then I had some low points. If I had somebody clap or cough or scream, it would leave a really high peak that was above all these others. So that when I boost the high peak to -1, nothing would change really. It was already so close to -1. But if I chop the tips off the peaks so that they're all even, then they all get boosted to -1, and everything gets louder. I'm going to do my boost with Effect and Amplify. My new peak amplitude is going to be -1. And now everything is right about at 0. The volumes above 0 get distorted, and so they're all just about as loud as they can get without getting distorted. No appeal on the docket today, just my own sin. No appeal on the docket today, just my own sin. I should have been dead on a Sunday morning, banging my head. I should have been dead on a Sunday morning, banging my head. The next thing I do is try to clean up a lot of the noise in the background. There's fuzzy, staticky air, probably from my computer humming noisily down below the mic. I'm going to take a selection of just noise And I didn't really leave myself a great just noise sample. This has a click and then it has the movement of my leather chair. But I'm going to go to Effect, Noise Reduction, get Noise Profile from this selection that I just made, and then do it again, go back to Noise Reduction, and now we'll listen to it. You can still hear the click and the movement of my leather chair, but the fuzziness is gone. We have all these options that we can use to fine-tune it. Noise reduction is obviously how quiet do you want to make the noise. If it's a 0, it's not quiet at all. The maximum is 48, and it's super quiet. The sensitivity has to do with what noises are getting reduced in this selection that we made. Right now it's pretty much just the fuzziness, but we could increase to try and capture that click and the noise of my chair. And increase them even further. You can also mess with the frequency smoothing to try and fine-tune it. So you'd think that'd be ideal. It cleaned up all the noise and the click and the movement of my chair. But if we were to apply that to the entire recording, we up the sensitivity and the noise reduction so much that it's going to affect our microphone and make it all warbly.
Court is in session, and a verdict is in.
It's not good. So as you mess with your noise reduction settings, you want to find a nice balance where your audio is clean, but the fuzziness in the background goes away. It's completely up to you, but what I did was left a low sensitivity because I only want the noise and the humming. I can take out the clicks of the keyboard and the movement on my chair when I'm editing. And I did enough noise reduction just to make it so the fuzziness goes away. I'll show you the difference between low frequency smoothing and high frequency smoothing real quick.
Court is in session.
This left a weird static, and this made it kind of tinny, so I'm going to try and kind of leave it somewhere in the middle. I've opened up a new session real quick to show you one more thing. And that's dealing with the gradual high and low that I had at the end of my recording. It's to talk about compression and the difference between using compression versus a hard limiter. They both do similar things, but in different ways. Compression is a very complicated subject, and if you decide it's something that you want to learn, I suggest going and just watching a ton of tutorials on it until you get it. It's basically a way for you to maintain the dynamics of your audio, the high volume and the low volume, instead of just chopping off the high points. In my personal opinion, I think it's probably more useful for instruments and less useful for podcast voices, but maybe that's just because I'm a pleb. But let's look at the difference. I'm going to do the hard limiter. I'll set it at -10, I'm not going to boost anything, and we'll see what happens. Chopped it right off. And then when I amplify to -1, it brings everything up. The problem is, I'll do hard limiter again. Everything within this limiter that I chopped off does not get any louder. The nice hill that I had is gone, and everything in the middle stays the same volume. If I had decided to use a compressor instead, which is under Effect and then Compressor, this horizontal range in my compressor is the recording from quiet up to loud. This vertical range in my compressor is going to be the output when I click OK, from quiet up to loud. The threshold is where I'm going to set a line just like I did with hard limiter. When I set the threshold for the hard limiter, I set it at -10. This time I'm going to use -24 for this example. You can see if I adjust my threshold, the graph changes. I believe they refer to this bendy part as the knee. I'm going to set my threshold at -24, which means I want my line right about here. Anything below the noise floor doesn't get boosted. This could be useful in public speeches if you want the crowd noise to not get amplified every time the person stops talking. The ratio is how big of an impact this compressor is going to have on our recording. So here's how it works. Similar to our hard limiter, I set a threshold at -24 right about here. All the peaks that are above it are going to get reduced just like with our hard limiter, except instead of just chopping them off, it's going to reduce them with a ratio. So let's start with a 2-to-1 ratio. Every 2 decibels above our threshold, 1, 2, get reduced down to 1 decibel. Not a very big change, so 4 turns into 2 decibels, 8 turns into 4 decibels. It's basically reducing everything in half above the threshold. The big difference is if you move the ratio up to 10-to-1. That means every 10 decibels above your threshold gets reduced down to a single decibel. A very noisy peak of 10 decibels gets quieted down to 1 decibel. A very noisy peak of 20 decibels gets quieted down to 2. A very noisy peak of 50 decibels gets quieted down to 5. Let's use these settings. We'll set our ratio at 2-to-1 and we'll click OK. The high volume was reduced, but instead of just chopping it right off, it's rounded so that it still has a gradual sound to it. Let's try 10 to 1. It brought the center peak down much more, almost flat. Let's see what happens if we set the threshold to -50, so it should be around here somewhere. Changed it dramatically. And if we adjust the ratio back to 2 to 1? There's a lot more to compression that I haven't even gotten into because I don't really have a need right now. I may someday as I mess with music more. But for now, as I do podcasting, I like to just use a hard limiter and chop off the peaks. Anyway, back to our old project. So I chopped off the peaks, I boosted all the volume to -1, and then I took out all the background fuzziness.
This is the voice of Tom.
That's actually about all that I do. This audio is ready to edit as far as I'm concerned. But there are other things you can do. We could get into equalization. This lets you boost and quiet certain frequencies across the spectrum. So you've got the bassiness on the left, the mid-range in the middle, and the treble on the right. So here's what my selection sounds like normally.
Court is in session, and a verdict is in.
If I use the presettings to choose a bass boost, you can see the left-hand side got boosted.
Court is in session, and a verdict is in.
You can use the bassiness to make it sound like he's muffled behind a wall or maybe underwater.
Court is in session. Court is in session. Court is in session.
It also gives you the option to take out the bass and the treble to make it sound like someone's on the telephone.
Court is in session.
Walkie-talkie.
Court is in session.
Make it sound like someone's coming over a tinny speaker by boosting the treble.
Court is in session.
A lot of people fine-tune this if they want to take out a very specific noise. Like if you had this entire band playing and you just had this one range where you wanted to remove a guitar solo, you could probably find a way to take it out. Or if you wanted to make karaoke and remove somebody's voice. So anyway, that's what Equalizer does. Overall, I thought that my microphone sounded a little bit tinny in here, so I actually might apply a bass boost.
You on the docket today, just my own sin.
But you want to have an order of operations, because when I did that, it actually boosted it above the 0 line and it might get a little bit distorted. So maybe I would have done my bass boost and then bumped everything up to full volume. Bumping everything up to full volume is usually the last step. But anyway, that's about all I have for how I clean up my audio. If you have any hate comments, leave them down below and I'll reply with eggplant emojis. And of course, don't forget to listen to LCP DnD on your favorite podcast service. LCP DnD is an actual play and audio drama podcast that's filled with comedy.
So, Igmit, why don't you go ahead and roll me a stealth check while you go towards that outhouse?
All right. Excuse me, folks. I got to go see a man about a buffalo.
With mystery.
She tore the 3 kids limb from limb and doesn't remember doing it at all.
Anyone who's gone crazy has either died or exploded.
With drama. Why do I have a guilty conscience now?
You're seeing a different way of life out here. It might be a harsher one, but there's a sense of justice.
And with horror.
This creature, it stands almost 20 feet tall, and it just makes this awful squelching sound as it's like looking at its hands and its legs and just taking stock of the situation.
Search for LCP DnD on your favorite podcast service or visit lcpdnd.com.